back to another podcast under Energonomics series. I'm Richa Mishra. My guest Meera Shankar needs no introduction in India's diplomatic circle. She served as India's ambassador to the US from April 2009 to 2011. Shankar, during her career, has also served as director to the Prime Minister's office from 1985 to 1991 and in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry from 1991 to 1995. While serving in the Ministry of External Affairs, she headed two important divisions dealing with the SAARC and the relations with Nepal and Bhutan. Prior to 2009, she served as India's ambassador in Berlin, Germany. Shankar was the first serving diplomat to be posted in Washington in more than 2 decades after G. Shankar Vajpayee. So who better than Shankar to take us through the current situation prevailing between India and the US? How easy was it for the Indian diplomats then to deal with US, and what are the challenges today?
So thank you so much, ma'am, for spending this time with us. And you have been there in that position as India's, representing our country in the US. You have dealt with how they at that time had their thinking and how the diplomacy worked. Now, over the years, now as we see, the situation has evolved and changed quite a bit. So, what I wanted to understand from you, ma'am, is that has Indian diplomacy matured enough now? I want to give an example of like what we understand is that Iran was sacrificed because of US pressure. However, for Russia, we have held our own, though the target is the same, energy. So, how do you see it, ma'am, as a diplomat?
Look, I think the situations were also different. Firstly, with regard to Iran, uh, the US talked to us in bilateral dialogue. It did not, publicly threaten us or impose sanctions. And we also were able to negotiate a carve-out for continuing our construction activities on the Chabahar port in Iran, which was seen as strategically important for India. So this was one that the way in which the US approached this was very different. I recall also during the Obama years, when the first set of sanctions were there on Iran, but negotiations were going on, we could have a dialogue. You could talk about reducing and explain that there's no way in which you can, suddenly stop importing oil from any particular country, because there are lead times, there are contracts, and so on. And their response was reasonable. Now what we've seen is that the US has suddenly upped the ante on India by imposing 50% tariffs, 25% on trade grounds and 25% for imports of Russian oil, about the highest that it has in the world, bar Brazil, on India. And this covers all exports to India, except a certain number of items which have been kept outside tariffs, like electronics, pharmaceuticals, refined petroleum products, if you will. And so it's a very different US approach. And I think that also has an impact on the way India responds. Secondly, the sanctions that the US was then talking about, the secondary sanctions, basically would have been imposed on the entities involved. And they involved an asset freeze of any assets belonging to those entities in the US, a travel ban of persons working for those entities to the US, and a suspension or a blockage of that entity using the US financial system in any way. So if you see the sanctions, because China stepped in and did huge deals with Iran, and the sanctions which were imposed were on individual Chinese companies, and they were the ones that I am talking about. For the first time, you're seeing 25% tariffs on across the board imports from a country on account of purchase of Russian oil. I think the third difference is that those sanctions, secondary sanctions, which the US was applying, applied across the board to all countries which were, or entities which were engaged with Iran. But in this case, only India has been singled out. And that appears to us extremely unreasonable and unfair because we are not the largest buyer of Russian energy, that is China. Last year, I think they bought $10 billion worth of energy more than India did. Europe is the second largest, and it also imports the largest importer of gas, Russian gas. And it imported a total of $67.5 billion almost in goods from Russia in 2024, and perhaps another $17 billion in services from Russia. So much more than India imported from Russia, including India's energy imports. Then, if you look at the backdrop, the previous US administration had publicly supported India's purchase of Russian oil to stabilize oil prices in the wake of the Ukraine conflict. At that time, oil prices had risen to $127 a barrel, and there was worry that it might actually escalate further. And if you've seen Janet Yellen's statements that India helped to stabilize the price of oil, statements from Jeffrey Pyatt, the Assistant Secretary for Energy at that time in the US, statements from former US Ambassador Eric Garcetti, all acknowledge the role that India played in stabilizing global oil prices at that time through its imports of Russian oil and the fact that the US had virtually green-lighted this. So again, it seems to us, very arbitrary and illogical that the US has done this. So I would say that on a number of counts, the Iranian situation and the way the US dealt with it was very different to the way the US has singled India out on the question of Russian oil imports. Illogical, not impactful, and likely to have the reverse impact that the US possibly is seeking.
Ma'am, I'm so glad you brought in the difference between the situation then and the situation today, vis-a-vis our dealing with Iran was concerned and our dealing with the current Ukraine war and Russian situation is concerned. But that brings me to my supplement question then. That do you think that if we increase trade ties with the US, the situation will improve further?
Well, India was the first to offer to negotiate with the US on a trade deal. And it seems by reports in the Washington Post and elsewhere that India had made fairly substantial offers in the negotiations, and that the US trade representative had put up a draft trade agreement to the president for approval. But the president turned it down and sent it back. Now, it seems that President Trump has been pushing for opening of Indian agriculture, dairy products, soy beans, and soybean feed, and other agri products. saying that India is tariff king because we maintain a weighted average of 34% or so, or 35% on agricultural imports, whereas the US has an effective tariff of about 4 to 5% on agricultural imports. Now, again, if you look at Europe, they maintain even higher tariffs on dairy, and they also have restrictions on the import of genetically modified organisms or products from the United States. Similarly, Japan has even higher, and some of their tariffs go up to 200% on these various items of agriculture or dairy. And for India, we are not into large scale commercial farming. We have subsistence farming where most of our farmers have farms of less than 2 acres, 1.5 acres, I was told. It's their survival mechanism. If we were to open across the board to large multinational corporations or mega corporations from the US, who also get US subsidies, actually, government subsidies, our farmers won't be able to compete. So there's no way that any Indian government will be in a position to do this across the board.
Well, that's a very valid point. But what we understand right now is that President Trump also wants us to get more energy from US. Now, getting energy from US is not cheap. It's very expensive. The cost of transportation itself is huge. So for India per se, it doesn't make economic sense, and we have maintained that position. This leads me to another question, ma'am. When you are there as a diplomat there, what is the tactic that has to be adopted when you are dealing with a nation like US?
Well, I think with the US, you have to be pretty hard headed. You either have to be in a position to give them something that they want or to deny them something that they want. And then you bargain, on the basis of that. And the I's have to be dotted, the T's have to be crossed. Having explained the difficulties in agriculture, there are products, agricultural products, which India could buy more of. For instance, dried fruits. We do get dried fruits from California, almonds and walnuts and cranberries and so on. Those are products which we could get. And similarly, I think edible oils could be one because we import quite a bit of palmoline from Malaysia or Southeast Asia. But the question is, is it cost competitive? Is, something like, I'm told that this year in 25, India's energy imports from the US have increased almost by 50% before the US put these reciprocal tariffs and special tariffs on Russian oil imports. Now India will have a rethink, if this is the way we are treated as a trading partner, then we have to reduce our dependence on the US market, diversify to reduce our vulnerability. So even as we are prepared to be pragmatic and to engage with the US to see where we can buy more, what we can do to work out a mutually beneficial trade deal, that trade deal is going nowhere if these special tariffs on Russian oil imports continue. And at the same time, the US is pressurizing the EU to impose 100% tariffs on China and India. Of course, the US has not put any tariffs on China itself. So it's singling out India, and it's in bad faith. It's bad faith to simultaneously begin negotiations and pressurize the EU to impose additional 100% tariffs on India. I think we have to wait and see. There's an opening because President Trump has softened his tone. He has said that the US is ready to resume negotiations and that we'll have a good trade deal in a short while, he's sure. But then at the same time, he has requested the EU to pressurize India by raising 100% tariffs on India and China for Russian oil imports. So there are very contradictory messages emerging out of Washington. And perhaps Washington is also not clear on what its objectives are. Does it want to use this as a pressure point on Russia without it expanding the sanctions on Russia itself? It won't have an impact because, as I said, there are no sanctions on China, which is the largest purchaser. There are no sanctions on the US, on the EU, which is the second largest purchaser because it's the largest buyer of Russian gas. And it won't have an impact because the US itself buys refined petroleum products from India and has kept them out of tariffs. So very contradictory policy impulses emanating from Washington. The only thing, as I said, the only silver lining is that both sides have agreed to resume trade negotiations.
Finally, one would say some kind of good sense would have prevailed on President Trump and he would have decided, to. But he's quite an unpredictable person, ma'am, as always known, and you people would know better. Will it impact the strategic relationship?
Well, right now, the signals we are getting from the US, institutional Washington, if you will, is that they would like the rest of the relationship to continue and to have continuity. So you've had the 2+2 partnership, talks at the additional secretary level from Ministry of External Affairs and the Defense. So it's a joint meeting with their US counterparts. You've had the US Army taking part or the US military taking part in the Indian military exercises. And you've had the Indian military taking part in US military exercises in Alaska. But then, if trust is eroded, I think it's very difficult to insulate the rest of the relationship. So I think the US has to take on board that they can't have a totally one-sided deal with India, that they have to take some of India's red lines seriously, and that they cannot single out India for punitive action with regard to Russian oil without there being overall ripple effects on the rest of the relationship. And you see that in terms of India's efforts to rebalance its relationship with the great powers, particularly China, and to intensify its search for diversified trade partners through free trade agreements that it is negotiating and which it is seeking to speed up, including with the EU. So I think it's for the US to pause and think of what kind of relationship does it want with India and how is it going to rebuild the trust, which, is fast eroding.
I guess they will come around because now India, it's not the same old India that he's talking about, and you just can't bully us. We may be big in numbers, but we have also grown over the years, and the economy also, ma'am. Ma'am, again, thank you so much for sparing us this time.
Thank you.